This is a brief tutorial on how to analyze downloaded GSS data, downloaded general social survey data using SPSS. And we're going to look today at a data set that I've already downloaded. Now, here I've opened up my SPSS file, my SPSS program, and this is what I initially see. And because I have previously opened this data set, it opens up with recent files. And this is the data set that we're going to be looking at today. So I could just click there. I can also go to wherever it is that I've downloaded this data set and simply click on the file name. I can also, I'll close this up. I can also go here to File, Open, Data, and then find the data set that I want and highlight it and open it. Okay, and here is the sample SPSS data set that we're going to be looking at today. It's a selection of variables downloaded from the SDA archive, the Survey Data Archive operated by Berkeley, California. And this is the variable view. Each of these represents the variables that I've downloaded. And the numbers are the numbers of variables. And you'll also see data view. The data view represents each respondent, each case, with the variables at the top. Case ID, this is case ID in year, it's person number 1 in 1972. The year is 1972, and this is the ID. This is age, sex, race. Let's go back to variable view. These are a little bit hard to read because it's so narrow. So what I can do is click at the very top on label, and that gives us the full description of the variable. Okay, well, we might want to begin by looking at a frequency distribution. That is how many people and what percentage of people are in the different values of a variable. And so what I'm going to do is click on up here at the top, Analyze. And we're only going to look at very simple descriptive statistics today. We're only going to look at frequencies and cross tabulations. So I go on descriptive statistics, frequencies, and then I choose the variable that I want to look at. Let's look at here the respondent's highest degree, highest educational degree. I can click on that, put that in the box. And then here on statistics, I may want measures of central tendency, that is the mean, the mathematical average, the median, the midpoint in the variable, and the mode, the value that has the highest number of cases. Now, for most of these variables, the mode is what is going to be most relevant because these are generally ordinal variables. And so it's the particular cell that has the highest numbers of respondents that is usually what we're going to look at. Okay, continue. And then, okay. And what this tells us is that about 21% of our respondents had less than high school educations. 51% had high school educations, about 6% junior college, and about 15% bachelor's degree and 7.3% graduate degrees. Now, keep in mind that this data set includes people from 1972 through 2018. And of course, educational attainment has changed greatly over those years. So if we're going to look at I don't want that output anymore. If we're going to look at how this may have changed over the years, we could look at a cross tabulation of year and education. Now, one problem here is that we have a different value for every year. So if you look at a cross tabulation of year by education, you're going to get 1972, 1973, 1974, and that's a lot of different years, and it may be hard to look at and hard to interpret. So what we're going to try to do is collapse those years. We're going to recode this year variable, and we can recode things by clicking on transform and then recode into different variables. You pretty much always want to recode into different values. And that's because if you recode into the same value, you've permanently changed your initial variable. And in order to get it back again, you'd have to go back and download it once again from the website. Okay, so we're going to recode year into different variables, and we don't want year plus respondent. That's hard to interpret. We want just the GSS year, and we can give this the new variable name decade, and the label, well, it represents decade, so we'll call it decade. Now, next we're going to click on old and new values, and here, since we're recoding a range of values, and this begins with 1972, if we want the 70s, we could do something like this. 1972 through 1980 is going to be recoded as 1. 1981 through 1990, these variables have to be mutual, these values have to be mutually exclusive. In other words, you don't want 72 through 80 and then 80 through 90, because that would put 1980 in two different new values. And it's going to be 2. And then 1990 through 2000 is going to be 3, and then 2000 through 2018, since that's the most recent year in which this is available, is going to be 4. So we've taken all those different years and we've put them into 4 decades. And we always have to click add and then continue, change, and OK. All right. Now, newly recoded variables or newly recoded variables are always going to be at the very end. And so here you see decade. And just to make it clear, when we see it in a cross tabulation, we may want to give those the names. 1, remember, is 1970s. We can call it that. 2 is 1980s. Add. 3 is 1990s. 4 is 2000s. Okay. Now we can look at change in educational attainment by decade and see if there has been a change. Okay, cross tabulation. And so we're going to put in respondents' highest degree. We're going to put that in the row. The convention is to put the thing that we're thinking of as influenced, the variable that we're thinking of as influenced, in the row, and the variable that we're thinking of as the predictor, or the thing that influences, in the column. That's not a necessary rule. You could do it differently, but if there's a reason for say setup. Now we'll see something here. If I press OK, and what you see here is that we have just numbers, and these are the numbers of respondents in each of these categories. And because there are different numbers of people in all of the rows for each of these years, this is difficult to interpret. SPSS does not automatically give you percentages in a cross tabulation. I typically forget to click on percentages. Here, I haven't forgotten. I've left it on purpose. So we're going to redo that. Descriptive statistics, cross tabs, and you see here on the right cells. And we want column percentages. We want the percentages down the columns because it is the variable in the column that we're thinking about as the predictor. Okay. I am not going to talk today about statistical significance, but if we wanted measures of these measures of statistical significance, then we would have to click there. All right. So, all right. 1970s, 35% of respondents had less than high school degrees. By 80s, 26%. 90s, 17%, and 2000, 14%. And on the other hand, if we look at college graduates, it went from under 10% to about 18% of people with just college. And of course, if we had college and graduate degree, that would be almost, it would be 28%, almost 30% of people had college degrees. So educational attainment apparently has increased over these decades. Now, let's say that we want to compare something else. Let's say that we want to compare father's education to the education of the respondents so that we can look at the strength of transmission of education. And let's say we want to make that simple and we want to just look at whether or not the father was a college graduate by whether or not the respondent is a college graduate or not. You could also, by the way, do this if you were interested in mother's degrees. So if we want to look at education in terms of college or no college, once again, we're going to have to recode. Okay, get rid of year. And we're going to find respondents' highest degree. And we're going to put that in there. And this is going to be just a college graduate measure. So we'll call it call grad, and we'll label it R is college grad. Okay. And then old and new variable values. Well, we're going to have to get rid of these values from the last variable we recoded. Remove those. And 0 through 2 in the original variable is less than college graduate. That is less than high school through junior college. You could recode it differently if you were thinking of high school and above high school, okay, as what is meaningful. That we would call that 0, no college education. And then 3 through 4, that's bachelor's degree or graduate degree, as 1. And then we're going to have to click on change and then OK. And then once more, that's going to be down at the very bottom. Zero, not college grad. And 1, college grad. All right. And if we want to compare father's education to son's education on that same basis, that is, if the father is a college graduate, what's the likelihood that the respondent is a college graduate? We would go back and we would look at father's highest degree. Again, you can look at also mother's highest degree. I think actually in reality, mother's highest degree is more strongly connected than father's. Or if you want to look at homophily, that is the tendency of people to be married to those with similar levels of education, you could also look at spouse's highest degree. Okay, but here we're going to recode father's degree into, we can call it Pa Call Grad. You could also, by the way, look at by gender, by sex, whether father's college degree is more closely related to the educations of sons and whether mother's college education is more closely related to the education of daughters. Okay, so father, college graduation. With any luck, many of you are better typists than I am. And we're using the same values for this variable, so we can just leave those in there and click continue, change, okay. And once again, that new variable is going to be at the very bottom. And we're going to recode that 0. Okay, well, let's look at that and see what the association between the educations of the college educations of fathers and the educations of respondents is. This, of course, would be both sons and daughters. It includes both men and women. And so I want cross tabulation, cross tab. There we go. Get rid of that. Father's college graduation. Cells, column statistics are still there. And this is kind of interesting. That is 81% of respondents whose fathers were not college graduates were themselves not college graduates. And among those whose fathers were college graduates, close to 59%, a clear majority, were college graduates. So looking at this, we would draw the conclusion that there's a connection between your father's education and your own education. Now, one thing that we might want to ask is, does this differ according to year or according to some other characteristic? And we could look at first, did educational transmission, did the transmission of parents' education to children change over the decades? And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to put decade into the control variables, and then we're going to click on OK. And this is going to give us a different decade for each, a different table for each decade. And here we see in the 1970s, among those whose fathers were not college graduates, 88% were themselves not college graduates. And about 50% of those whose fathers were college graduates were themselves college graduates. And then, you know, instead of going through the tedium of looking at each of these decades, you could see that transmissibility decreased a bit. Or, you know, another way to look at this might be that the probability of being a college graduate yourself increased over the decades, both for those who themselves, who came from families that were not, in which the fathers were not college graduates, and in those in which the fathers were. By the 2000s, about a quarter of those whose fathers weren't college graduates themselves were college graduates, and close to 2/3, 63% of those whose fathers were college graduates themselves were college graduates. And so it looks like the probability of an education increased, of a college education increased for both categories, but still we have some transmissibility. You know, still, if your father was a college graduate, you're more likely to be a college graduate yourself. Now, a little bit of an aside, those who define equity as there being no predictability between background and outcome might find this disturbing. There is still predictability in educational outcome. I would say that definition of equity is maybe best described as an absurdity. There's always a connection between the background of people and where they end up. Okay. one of the useful things about cross-tabulation in SPSS is we can do multiple layers. Let's look at another relationship here. Let's look at the relationship between parental education, understood here as father's college education. You could also construct a variable that combines both father and mother. I'm not going to do that today. Let's look at race and whether parental transmission is stronger or weaker by race. Okay, so I've put what is R's race, and I'm not going to recode this because the way that the GSS codes race, it is only in 3 categories: white, black, and other. All right. And so this is white and this is black. Actually, this is a more detailed version of race. I think I wanted to actually look at the simpler version of race. So let's go back. Not because I don't think that's relevant, but because we're trying to keep it simple here. Okay, race of respondent. This one here. Okay, yeah, this is the simpler version. And you can see here that we have different tables for white and black. And in the 1970s, 80% of whites whose fathers were not college graduates were also not college graduates. But if we look at blacks, 87% of those whose fathers were not college graduates were themselves college graduates. And if fathers were college graduates back in the 70s, 58% of whites were college graduates compared to only 46% of African Americans. And then this is, for over all the years. We're not looking at decades yet. So what this tells us is that 80% of whites whose fathers were not college graduates and 87% of blacks. So you were more likely to not be a college graduate yourself for blacks, whether or not your father was a college graduate. See here, 54% of blacks whose fathers, 48% of blacks whose fathers were 54% of blacks whose fathers were college graduates were not college graduates, a clear majority, compared to only 42% of whites. Okay. And we can, in SPSS, add multiple layers. We can add another layer of control variable. That is, we can then go back and do what I had referred to before. We can look at it by decade, and we can break it down into, did the association grow stronger or weaker over decades? Rather than drag this out into tedious detail, this is the 1970s. 87% of whites whose fathers were not college graduates were not college graduates. And about 50% of whites whose fathers were college graduates were themselves college graduates back in the 70s. Among Black Americans, 93%, or just about all of those whose fathers were not college graduates, were themselves not college graduates. And even among those whose fathers were college graduates, only 35% had graduated from college. So, there's a clear tendency back in the 1970s, if you're Black, to have less education regardless of parental educational background. And then let's just skip down to the 2000s and see if by the 2000s we see some change. Well, one thing that we see here again is that for whites, whether or not your father was a college graduate, you are more likely to have graduated from college. About a quarter of whites whose fathers had not graduated from college had. And 63% of whites whose fathers had graduated from college also had graduated from college. And if we look then at Blacks, there still is a strong association. 82% of those whose fathers were not college graduates weren't college graduates. But 18% of those whose fathers hadn't graduated from college had. And if we look at those who, African Americans whose fathers had graduated from college, a majority had graduated from college, had finished college, 51%. And so it looks like for African Americans, two things happened. First, there were higher rates of college graduation overall, but second, there was increased transmissibility of parental education to the education of respondents. Okay, well, I hope that this introduction to how to analyze variables in a simple way using SPSS is helpful. And if you have any questions or if there are any problems, please let me know. And